Hello. Although this episode of Victorian Art Pottery is all about the work of Charles Hubert Brannam, I thought that before we started, we'll just have a wider view of West Country art potteries. It says on the screen, the art potteries situated in the southwest of England that prospered in the Victorian period have a very different character to those in London or in the North and Midlands. We're talking there about factories such as that run by Dalton in Lambeth, or Bretby in the Midlands, or Linthorpe in the North. Compared to those latter places, the West Country was somewhat underdeveloped, and life was perhaps a little simpler. One of the main reasons for this was poor communications. Obviously, it isn't really the place to set up a large industrial complex or even a big factory if you can't get your products out to a wide market. But with the coming of the railways, seasonal tourism grew rapidly. West Country producers were not only able to sell to these more local holiday makers, but they were also able to dispatch their goods to markets in other parts of England, principally, of course, to London. In commercial terms, art pottery found a ready market in London, as was witnessed by the success of the Barum Pottery in Barnstaple. But in South Devon, large quantities of souvenir motto wares were sold locally to visiting holiday makers. It is not that this was restricted to South Devon, and indeed some motto wares were made in Barnstaple as well. The great advantage, of course, being that there was always a seasonal but very reliable vacation market or market for holiday makers. The styles of pottery produced in North Devon in the Barnstaple area did vary somewhat from the designs produced on the south coast around Torquay. There's quite a lot of overlap, but there are also some notable differences. Although both centres produce wares characteristic of their areas, the Barnstaple wares tend to be more driven by the ideals of the Victorian aesthetic movement. More about that in a moment. Whereas in the south, motto wares tend to dominate production, and the centres are perhaps more in keeping with the local crafts traditions than they do in the Barnstaple area. Further north, just south of Bristol at Clevedon, the sunflower pottery of Sir Edmund Elton, the baronet potter, displayed even more eccentric wares. But production was quite small at this centre, and these products are not included here. If you wish to go and look at a good collection of Branham to familiarise yourself with the sort of wares that Branham was producing, there is no finer place to go than the Museum of Barnstaple and North Devon, which is situated in Barnstaple, very close to the town centre. It's easy to reach. As you can see here, there is a slightly older building in the middle of the image here, but to the right you'll notice a modern addition, and the museum itself has a wide variety of interesting specimens of all manner of things made in the locality of Barnstaple. One of the things that I like about the Barnstaple Museum is that its displays of ceramics are not only large and varied, but also in their own way quite traditional. If you wish to learn a lot about the products of a particular factory, the best thing to do is to go and see a lot of specimens. The more the merrier, quite frankly, so that you can get a good idea of the run of production, not just in terms of different shapes and sizes, but also chronologically, the differences between early production, middle production, and later. And indeed, most art potteries are no longer operating, so one can look at their various periods now in some sort of, I suppose, isolation. The whole thing has become rather ossified. If you look at the images on the screen at the moment, you can see that this is what I admire. These cabinets absolutely cram full of specimens of Branham pottery. You can see on both images that there are many shapes and sizes and forms of pots, but also lots of different colours are used in the decoration of these wares. And I mention particularly decoration because that is something that I think Branham is most notable for. There are pots, monochrome decorated pots, but in general, the late Victorian pieces are highly decorated with a number of animal and plant motifs. And I must say, being as Barnstaple is quite close to the coast, a lot of fish appear on their wares. I won't look at anything here in detail other than one item, which is on the right hand image. If you look down to the bottom of the picture, almost centrally, you can see on the second shelf up from the bottom, from the floor, you can see a small blue jardiniere, brown coloured on the inside, but on the outside you can see it has three rather curvy handles. These curved handles, or snake handles as they're sometimes referred to, are quite typical of art pottery in the southwest. Brannam's Barumware. Barumware, so named as a recollection of Barnstaple's Roman name. The best known Victorian art pottery in the southwest of England is undoubtedly the Branham pottery, Lichton Street, Barnstaple, North Devon. Art pottery production started in 1879 when Charles Hubert Brannam took over the pottery from his father. The pottery is run by his father was making largely peasant, I suppose it would be called, utilitarian pottery, useful vessels for a local market, and it had been failing for quite some time. And young Branham, who had trained at the Barnstaple School of Art, wanted to produce artistic ceramics. His father was at first not very enthusiastic about his son's ambitions. He did make the concession that Charles could actually use the pottery to make his new artwares, providing that he paid for the production, the decoration, and the firing of said wares. But before long, he had decided that probably it was a good idea to turn over the whole of Lichton Street to his son. Indeed, that's what happened. So from about August of 1879, we can date the arrival, as it were, of Charles Hubert Brannam's Barumware pottery. Not called Barumware, I think, in the first few days, but soon to be given that name. In the early 1880s, he developed this Barumware, a very Victorian, highly decorated form of decorative pottery rather than utilitarian wares. He wanted to expand his market from purely a local one to a national market. And to do that, he decided that he would like to exhibit at Howell and James's shop in Regent Street in London, a shop that by this stage become quite well known for its connections with arts and crafts and aesthetic movement productions. Later, he acquired an important client in the form of Liberties of London, still trading today and still very much a purveyor of quality artistic goods. Now, despite the fact that the pottery had been failing under his father, when Charles Hubert took over, it seems to have been successful almost from its inception, selling his highly decorated pottery to several members of the royal family, some of whom actually visited the works in Barnstaple. And this went a long way to establishing a sound market base in London. On the right-hand side of this picture, we can see quite clearly a photograph of a rather distinguished-looking Charles Hubert Brannam, round about 1905. Now, we don't know too much about his early marketing strategies, But we do know that this is the front cover of the earliest known catalogue issued by the company in 1898. It may well be that just selling locally and exhibiting in London was enough to sell the output of the pottery to make a good profit from it. And indeed, by the 1880s, the pottery was making a very good profit indeed. However, this is the earliest one we know, and it shows us a typical barrenware pot. Three handles, of course, those curvilinear or snake handles at the top. And on the main body of the pot, the very intense decoration that was so popular with Victorian clients of the day. You can see just by looking at this front cover the importance of royal patronage to the developing firm. It's quite obvious when you look at the list of some of those better off clients. The Queen, Queen Victoria, is mentioned, as is the Duke of Hesse, the Duke of Connaught, and Her Royal Highness Princess Louise, one of Victoria's daughters. And what were they selling at this period? Well, I think I've suggested to you what the pottery looked like, and we've seen the interior of the museum. But here's a picture, photograph taken probably around about 1900, which illustrates the sort of production that was taking place at Brannam's Lichtenstein Street Pottery in the late 19th century. As you can see, it's largely decorative. It's rather shiny, I think you can see. It's highly glazed and multicoloured. Large pieces, small pieces, to fit the pocket, as it were, of potential or a range of potential clients. Mostly made by hand, thrown on a wheel, but with a few pieces, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, elements of the production produced in moulds. One of the unfortunate things about studying Victorian art pottery is that many of the factories no longer exist, and very few people can say that they're still making art pottery from the Victorian period onwards. For example, at Barnstaple in Leeds, the factory no longer exists. There's not any evidence really. It's now a modern housing estate. But in Barnstaple, we're rather lucky. Perhaps things move rather differently, perhaps slowly, more slowly than they did in Leeds, because we still have, although now no longer used for pottery production, we still have the original buildings for Brannam's Art Pottery. We can see on the picture on your screen at the moment this rather wonderful blue plaque, the Barnstaple Heritage Trail, that is actually attached to the outside of the building that you're going to see in the next illustration. Now, Brannam's went out of production in the late 20th century, but fortunately we have the buildings that are still extant, and particularly impressive is the street frontage. It was a double frontage. You can see just over half of it in this particular image. It's a double frontage with a very large building on the left and then a very similar building on the right hand side. And these buildings are joined together by a sort of single depth room or corridor going through the space between the two blocks. And it's over a very large entranceway to a yard or corridor or alleyway, which goes on for quite some distance beyond the facade of the building. And it was along this yard to either side that the production took place. That's where the kilns were, it's where the throwing took place, the moulding, storage, preparing the clay, etc. And you can see there quite clearly some of the shop frontage from this period. The actual facade itself is part of a reorganisation that Branham made enough profits to consider in the middle of the 1880s. So not a lot has really changed dramatically since the middle of the 1880s. This photograph was taken by me in 2022, and that becomes quite obvious when you see those ubiquitous litter bins. It's very hard to take architectural pictures of great worth these days without moving the bins. Unfortunately, I didn't think that I ought to do that at the time I took the photograph. Perhaps rather a pity. However, this is a picture that I took several decades ago. And you can see that when I took this photograph from Lichton Lane, which runs at a right angle to Lichton Street, that the showrooms for Branham's and the production at Branham's was still taking place. And here we can see, although the green gate is closed, so you can't get access to the production areas, you can see that the shop doorway is there in the middle of the screen, and that is open. And I actually went through that and had a look at the interior of the shop on that visit of mine all those years ago. You can just about see a nice display of the Branham wares that were for sale in that shop at that time. And above that, you can see that wonderful advertisement by appointment to Her Royal Highness Princess Christian. So that royal patronage always very, very important to Branham's. What did it look like inside? Well, unfortunately, I didn't photograph the inside. More's the pity, I wish I had. But in this image, you can see what it looked like, or what it looked like earlier on in the 20th century. This is a photograph taken very late 19th century, early 20th century, and you can see the range of pots that existed within that shop that you were just looking at in the previous photograph. You can see quite clearly that the walls of the shop were laid out with a series of shelving units to display row after row of these wonderful decorative pots. And in the foreground, you can see on the floor a series of very large jardiniere pots as well. Again, most of them highly decorated. By the door that you can see on the right-hand side of the image, you can see 3 decorative plaques made by Branham's hanging up on the wall above a jardiniere pot and stand with a typical Victorian plant in it, if I may say so. But today, unfortunately, none of that exists. But this is what does exist. I was not able to gain access to the shop, so I'm afraid that this is an image that I took last year, 2022, of the shop interior, but I'm afraid through the window. So you do have a little bit of glare showing up in the top of this and reflection showing up in the top of this picture. You can see that those wonderful wall units are still extant, now painted black rather than what must have been cream or white. But they're still there. I don't know for how long. I don't know what the purpose will be for this retail shop in the future, but let's hope that it becomes a going concern and that they keep the fittings. Time will tell. Now, here's a photograph taken in the earlier days of the pottery, after that 1880s reconstruction of the factory offices and shop frontages, but showing the location of the original shop. If you go to the site today, you've got shop windows to either side of that alleyway that you can just see on the left-hand side. But in Brannam's time, in the early days of Brannam's pottery, the first shop was on the right-hand side rather than on the left-hand side of the alleyway that goes through the middle of the 2 buildings. So this is the original, a shot of the original shop. Again, look at the by appointment sign above the door, the Art Pottery sign underneath it, and then we've got C.H. Brannam's Barum ware. Barum, of course, this reference to the Roman name for Barnstaple. It doesn't, unfortunately, look like this today. After the factory shut down in the late 20th century, this doorway, rather than the other one, was actually bricked in, but in recent times it has been renovated and restored to look like this. And here we have this a rather nice image of what it must have looked like, or almost what it must have looked like when it was new. Notice, if you will, the columns, or dwarf columns, to either side of the main entrance. That's where the pointy archway is. And at one time, those columns were not visible because they've been bricked up. I don't know for how long, but they were bricked up, certainly temporarily. Now they are reopened and those columns are restored in position. And here is an image of one of those columns. And this is quite a useful piece of architectural decoration to be able to see, because you get some idea of the manner in which they actually decorated their products, because this is a product of the Barnum pottery. And as you can see, there are lots of bright colours, but the actual decorative elements stand proud of the background, because the background has been carved away to give a certain amount of relief, bas relief appearance to the coloured decorative elements. Let me just move that to one side just to remind you what this looks like. Very, very handsome indeed. It's nice that those have survived. Right, well, let's now have a look at some of the products of Charles Hubert Brannam's art pottery. The Barnstaple Museum collection includes a number of early pieces from Charles Hubert Brannam's production. In fact, probably mostly from the actual year 1879, perhaps running for a year or two longer. His first experiments in decoration drew quite heavily on the local sgraffito tradition and include beakers similar to those made by other potteries in both North and South Devon. When we talk about sgraffito decoration, well, these are examples of that type of decoration, style of decoration, and how it was done at Branham's is that most of the pots were made of this rather bright orange brown clay. They were then coated, these early examples, with either a yellow, creamy or white slip coating, which was then scratched away quite carefully to create designs. It means when you cut this layer away, you can see the brown clay beneath. It's a bit like some of Dalton's stonewares that you may be familiar with or remember from earlier editions in this Victorian Art Pottery series. So this is basically what sgraffito ware looks like. Etching away one colour to reveal the base colour below. And you can see there on the left-hand side a very nice simple form, but with this rather elegant looking bird. Charles Hubert Brannam himself was apparently very fond of pigeons. I don't know much about that, but certainly that was one of his hobbies. Most of the production at this time, I think, probably was in the form of simple beakers and typical native style jugs like the one you see on the right hand side. Some of the pieces can be quite complex in terms of the decoration, but they do quite often look a little like Hannah Barlow's work for Dalton of Lambeth. After this early start, Branham wanted to go much further, and in 1881 he employed his first designer, a man called James Dewdney, who produced much of the blue and green sgraffito decorated wares that were produced at this time. A year or two later, he started to employ a man called William Barum. Now, Barum had worked for Dalton of Lambeth, and he will have seen this style of sgraffito decoration in his work there. Whether, in fact, he arrived early enough to produce many of these simple forms of decoration, I do not know. It's open to debate, but certainly he had experience of coloured glazes that he had worked with at Dalton's, and so he was a great addition to the workforce. He was also an excellent decorator and designer. Very much an artist of his time, Charles Hubert Brannam was very interested in the English aesthetic movement. And in particular, he was influenced by the Japonism, which affected much art design of the 1870s and running into the 1890s. Shops like Liberty's in London were selling a great many Japanese-style goods, pottery, lacquerwork, furniture, for example, textiles, and Japanese prints were freely available. And all of these things had an influence on Brannam's pottery. In 1880, Thomas Cutler had published a grammar of Japanese ornamented design, and this included full-page illustrations of Japanese art, Japanese designs that were to influence Charles Hubert Brannam and his artists. 2 years later, Christopher Dresser published his book, Japan, Its Architecture, Art and Art Manufactures. And again, Christopher Dresser, very well known designer of the period, was very influenced by Japonism. Both these books were made available to Brannam's artists and designers in the library of the local literary and scientific institution, as was a run of the magazine produced by Samuel Byng entitled Artistic Japan, or indeed originally in French, which is why you can see the illustration we have of that particular publication is entitled Le Japon Artistique. All these publications, as well as others, were available to the artists that Brannam employed. So many designs were created, such as one on the right, illustrating fish, flowering branches, various flowers, etc., as well as animals such as herons, dragons, and other elements taken from Japanese art and design. It's quite easy to see the connection between that cover and the vase, very simple shaped vase, that you see on the right hand side. But it's a rather beautiful piece. It does illustrate the influence and the strength of that influence. On this image, you can see on the left another piece from the Barnstaple Museum, which illustrates the Barum Pottery's interest in Japonism in the 1880s. This rather unusual piece, showing a boy riding through the water, you can see the waves, on the back of a fish, represents Kintaro, a figure from Japanese folklore. Kintaro was a child of superhuman strength who is recorded in Japanese mythology as wrestling and fighting with all number of creatures. But in this instance, it is a giant fish, a carp. The boy and the fish is attached to a fairly simple conical beaker. It's rather rough on the outside, and looking at the colour, it could represent either the currents underwater, or it could represent the mountains, the roughness of the mountains where Kintaro was apparently brought up. This piece shows clear evidence of the Brannam Pottery's interest in Japanese subject matter, in Japonism, and illustrates that the artists who worked for Brannam were fairly familiar with at least one or other of the Japanese prints that you can see on the right hand side of the screen. These three prints, the one on the right by Kuniyoshi, dates a little earlier to 1835, but the two smaller ones in the centre of the screen were both of them produced by Yoshitoshi in the 1880s, probably around about 1882, would have been current around about the time that this piece was produced at the pottery. So It does illustrate quite a degree of intellectuality and knowledge in the artistic makeup of the Barnum pottery. It's a rather interesting point, and it's rare that you get such direct reference to Japanese prints in this manner. This is a rather nice piece. This vase decorated again with the curving or stake-like three handles that we've been talking about. It's a vase decorated with a mythical beast, in this instance some form of winged dragon, probably again taken from Japanese mythology. And on the reverse is a floral motif, dates to around about 1900. I think looking at both the front and the reverse of this vase, it's quite interesting to note the thick impasto style of painted decoration, common feature on Branham wares. It reflects the sort of current styles of the day, particularly from, I suppose, about the 1870s, 1880s, to produce this very heavy slip decoration, which is a form of pats a pat, as practiced with rather more elegant pottery forms produced by Sèvres in France and by Minton's in England. The three twisted handles on the neck of the vessel, as we've said, are not unusual, and they are fairly common on pieces such as we have suggested before. Also, it's worth noting the floral design on the reverse of this vase, a vase which stands about 12 inches, 30 centimetres high, quite a large piece. It very much reflects the style of Art Nouveau, which was very popular, this love of all things natural, around about 1900. Whilst we're on the subject of decoration, we can see that Branham's produced various decorative motifs inspired by a whole range of influences, not just Japonism, but classical influences, Islamic and other Oriental prototypes. All of these were used in one way or another on Branham ware. Sgraffito techniques were often employed, as we've mentioned already, with the decoration being incised through one or more layers of contrasting coloured clay slips to reveal different colours beneath the surface. Remember, most Branham, not all, but most Branham products are made from a brown to orange coloured clay, but the slips can be almost any colour. And although blue and green are very commonplace, and white as well, you can get a whole range of different colours. So going back to look at this particular piece, which is a rather nice Barum ware vase decorated by William Barron around about 1886, we can see here that the vase has rather nice decoration which stands proud of the background. So the bird and the flowers actually stand out from the background. And this is possible because, as on so many of these vases, the background has been carved away, very shallow carving, but it's often employed to leave the main design picked out in relief. Details of the design were often emphasized in thick painted slips before the body was covered in a glossy, clear glaze. As in the floral illustration, the previous illustration, around about 1900, the sinuous lines of Art Nouveau can be seen influencing some decorative designs. I rather like this piece because it hasn't really had a lot of embellishment. It's a nice dark brown design which stands out against the, I suppose, bluey green background that you see here. Quite elegant. You can see there it seems rather rough in the background, but this is where this carving has taken place. As might be expected from Barnstaple's location on the North Devon coast, decorative schemes include fish and underwater flora, frequently used on Branham pots. Here we can see another Branham vase with low relief carved decoration by William Barron. The date of this one is 1887. And you can see the same sort of technique used as on the previous image, though in this image, it's not carved roughly, it's carved and then smoothed over. So it gives a slightly different impression. Those rather frightening fish will find their origins most probably in Japanese prototypes. And here we can see a close-up of another Branham vase, but with a similar decoration. But notice on this one, it doesn't have the precision or the character of the last two images, and the background has been rather roughly executed. And this is quite often found on Branham pieces. It's nice to get a piece that looks like the William Barron pieces you've seen, but quite often it's not quite as well executed as you can see on this particular decorative, or this particular detail. So decorative technique then very varied. In fact, this background technique can often be rather shallow in its carving, and then simply just covered in a series of small dots. It does the job, it's very effective, but it doesn't have quite that polish that you've just seen in earlier versions. Notice though that with this particular piece, a variety of colours come into play. So the background colour is largely blue. Some of that's been carved away and then decorated with dots and a white slip. But that which remains and isn't blue, as you can see, utilises a sort of browny orange colour and also some greens. There's a rather nice, fantastic bird on this piece, but it's a nice detail of this much larger vessel. Now, most early Branham ware, as we've mentioned already, was hand thrown and signed on the base in script by Charles Hubert Brannam. Vessel types include vases, dishes, jars, umbrella stands, knife handles, jardinières, jugs, tea and coffee pots, candlesticks, novelties, and even commemorative pieces. The principal decorators in the 1880s were William Barron and James Dewdney. The latter continued working at the pottery into the 20th century, but Barron left in 1893 to start his own pottery. That happened in 1895 at Roll Quay in Barnstaple. It was a pottery which then lasted in competition with Brannam's until the son of William Barron died in 1937. This son is quite interesting. His name is Frederick Barron, and he actually worked, after his father had left Brannam's, he actually worked at Brannam's from around about 1897 through to, again, around about 1910. And then later, when his father retired, he went on to run the Roll Quay Barron factory. When he died, the pottery, as we said, was then sold off to Branham's and remained open for a further year before its staff were moved over to Lichton Street and centred on what was, if you like, the parent company. I thought I'd just show you this piece to make another point about the manufacture of Branham's pottery. You can see quite clearly that background, the dotted or stipple background that we've just been looking at on a previous image. It's very, very true that most of the pieces produced by Branham's were actually thrown on a wheel, and Charles Hubert Brannam was quite a potter himself, and much of the decoration was left to people like Dewdney and Barron. But right from the very beginning, certain pieces, little details as it were actually produced in moulds. So things like these dragons that are attached as handles to this vase, or indeed on the one on the right-hand side, a slightly closer view of another vase, these would have been produced in moulds and then luted on to the much larger body of the pots. So it just goes to show that there was quite a variety in terms of manufacturing techniques at the factory. All sorts of shapes and subject matter were produced. I thought I'd just show you this rather nice side-handled jug here, typical shape for a jug, and a rather nice incised design of geese on it. So Branham wares are frequently decorated with a whole range of, as we've said before, fish and birds and animals. Like many art potteries, Branham issued a range of novelty figures, as we can see on this slide. And although the standard decorated pots were very popular in the 1880s, by the 1890s, the production included quite a lot of novelty figures and various novelty pieces. These were very popular in the 1890s and lasted right through into the First World War and indeed beyond. These figures were moulded but often utilised a good deal of hand finishing. And when you look at these pieces, you can see a lot of the incised lines were produced by hand. Branham himself had a soft spot for pigeons and actually showed them and won prizes. But cats also seem to have been particularly popular as a product produced by the factory. Like many Branham products, these novelties were often painted in blue, green or brown, although numerous other colours are found. This is a cat produced by Branham's in 1902. This rather nice Branham floral dragon flower holder of 1903, remember so many of these pieces actually carry date marks underneath, etched by Branham himself, is shown here to illustrate what I mean, the fact that not everything is done by hand. This particular dragon flower holder would have been produced, I suspect, in two stages: a mould for the actual sort of boat-shaped decorated area or decorated bottom of the piece, and then there would have been a moulded dragon luted on to this part of the design before it was fired, of course, as a handle. There's quite a large market, it seems, for this type of decorative piece, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century. As with all things produced, some things are rarer than others. And this rather lovely piece, it does have a little bit of damage there on the, you can see on the left-hand side of the picture. But this rather rare Branham monk and umbrella wall pocket, which dates to around about 1900 and was designed by Beauchamp Wimple, is a rather lovely piece to get your hands on. There are some quite comical models to be found in Branham's repertoire. And this as a wall pocket is rather fun, but it's not unusual. In fact, the actual form that you see is rare, but wall pockets in general were made by several art potteries, often in the shape of flowers, sometimes fish or even birds. But it's rather a nice one, to discover. And now for something just a little bit different. Okay, well, nice to see you all. I know you don't see much of me on this particular series, but I thought this was a good opportunity to visually introduce myself, but also to pursue our knowledge of Branham. Over here to my left, you can see a very nice matched pair of vases produced by Branhams in the late 19th century. You can see that they're matched because if you can make it out from where we're filming, they have fishes on the top of these vases as decoration. They're
modelled onto the top of the vases, and you can see this one faces that way and that one faces the other way, so they are definitely a match pair. They're quite typical of Brannam's wares. Brannam uses a lot of bright blues and dark blues, but quite often the vase colours are blue and white against a green background, and you can see that quite clearly on these vases. And if we lift one of them up to show you, you can see here that's what we have with these vases. Typical of most Brannams, if you just catch the light as I move it, very, very shiny indeed. They have this clear, transparent, shiny glaze, and most Brannam products from the 1890s into the early 1900s will be shiny like this. You can see quite clearly, I think, here that we have an image very much affected by Japonism, as we've mentioned earlier on in this episode of the series, with this marvellous carp. This Japanese carp is actually, if you like, swimming down into the depths. The carp stands quite proud of the vase. It's in bas relief, as it were, and you can see swirls of water going round, and they're also indicated with relief decoration. And you can see here a few little waves or movements in the water, and these are also in very high relief indeed. But they're really quite wonderful, and you can see quite clearly what we mean by the influence of Japan. So a nice pair, and of course always a pair, a lot more expensive to collect than just singles, because pairs of vases like this go for a premium, as it were. If we look at the base of these vessels, and I'm having a look now, and we can see here quite clearly on the base the signature, and I'll show this to the camera. So if you look clearly at the base of this vessel, and both of them are much the same, you can probably just make out across the centre of the vessel's base the signature of C.H. Brannam himself. He seems to find at this early period of production virtually every vessel. Sometimes you'll find an inscribed date as well, and the marks C.H. Brannam and any dates, and this one doesn't have a date unfortunately, they are inscribed on the base with some form of sharp object. It may just be a pencil or a piece of the end of a knitting needle or something like that, but an inscribed mark on the base before the vessel is fired. That is when it's still leather hard, so it's drying out but it hasn't yet been fired. And so you can see quite clearly the incised signature of Charles Hubert Brannam. Also, you may be able to just make out the initials FB for the artist who actually did the decoration on this particular vessel or pair of vessels, and it's FB for Frederick Baron, of course. So here we are then. C.H. Brannam's Barum ware, and in this instance decorated by Frederick Baron, and that dates this to a fairly narrow time frame, as we mentioned before with the dates of Frederick Baron. Okay, hope you've enjoyed seeing these things in the flesh.
Having seen an example of the base of a Branham pot showing its marks, its maker's marks, I thought it might be a good idea just to finish off this talk on Branham pottery with a look at other marks that were current in the late 19th, early 20th century at Brannam's pottery. If we look at the marks now showing on the screen, we can see at the top is the incise mark used on early sgraffito decorated pottery from about 1879 through to 1881. This was then replaced by a very similar incise mark, often this time with a date added. Not always, but quite often. and this can be found on most examples of Brannam's Barum ware between 1882 and about 1914. The signature appears to have been executed in person by Charles Hubert Brannam himself. Overlapping with this mark and dating from as early possibly as 1900 and again going through to the First World War, we can see an impress mark to be found on smaller articles, and we can see that's the third one down on the list. It just says C.H. Brannam, Barum, North Devon. And then finally on this sheet we see marks using the word limited, and this is post 1914, and this is either impressed or rubber stamped. Brannam was of course not the only person making Victorian art pottery in Barnstaple, and here we have a few contemporary marks from other North Devon art pottery manufacturers. At the top we have Baron's Roll Key Pottery. This is the incise mark used from around about 1895 to 1937-38, when the pottery was bought out by Brannam's. And see, it usually just has Baron Barnstaple. A little bit more about Baron's pottery in just one moment. This factory also had an impress mark from about 1905 onwards to the end of the pottery, and that's just Baron North Devon. Also in Barnstaple, in the 1870s, 1876 to be precise, Alexander Lauder began the Devon Art Pottery, which employed about 40 people. It was always much smaller than Brannam's, but again was a competitor. This closed in 1914. On this pottery, various incised and impressed marks include the words Lauder, sometimes with Barum or Barnstaple. We can see that on the bottom right, Lauder, Barum, and again, usually with a hand-incised signature or mark. Looking at the image on the screen at the moment, we can see three small vases. From the left, we can see, firstly, a Baron vase. In the centre is a Branham vase, and on the right-hand side, the third one along, a vase made by Lauder's factory. It doesn't seem, looking at this image, that there was an awful lot of difference between the three factories, and indeed, they each specialised in slightly differing wares, but it's got to be said that many of them do look very, very similar. Baron, for example, has sometimes been seen as making mere pastiches of Brannam's pots, but indeed he did make quite a variety, including some original designs of his own. And Lauder was never very large, and pottery made by Alexander Lauder tended to be decorated with the same sort of creatures, fish, etc. that you are going to see on the wares created by the other two potteries. In terms of fabric, again, they look superficially much the same. Before we finish this talk, it might be worthwhile just saying a few words about William Leonard Baron, perhaps the more important of the competitors facing Brannam's. William Baron, as it says on the screen, joined Dalton and Company of Lambeth in his late teens, probably having trained at the Lambeth School of Art. He joined Brannam's in Barnstaple around about 1884 to decorate and model pottery. His inspiration came from natural forms such as birds, fish and flowers. He was perhaps not as settled as he might have been at Brannam's, and he continued his studies to improve, I think, himself while at Brannam's, and became a qualified art master in 1893. He then left Brannam's and started up his own pottery at Roll Key in Barnstaple in 1895. and that went on through until 1937. He made a variety of decorated and motto wares, as well as novelty figures, and you can see quite a number of similarities between the Branham production and that produced by Barum. And here on the right we have a rather nice little novelty, grotesque figure with glass eyes. Things like these glass eyes were commonly used on a number of ceramic models at this time by several of the leading Victorian art potteries. Right, to finish, we have the reading list, as it were, and it's fair to say that there are a number of publications that deal with Victorian art pottery made in the Barnstaple area and indeed the West Country in general. One of the most informative is that written by Peter Branham. He was the last member of the Branham family to actually run the pottery. It didn't finish with him, but it was bought out by another company. And of course, is now just a memory in the past. Bartlett's book, quite useful, as you can see there, and Victoria Bergeson's. But the Peter Branham book, I think, is one that should always be read because it is a very personal story, has a lot of detail. And then we have the book on North Devon art pottery there, as well as E.L. Thomas, always a good standby in these studies. Right, well, we've reached the end of this particular presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you'll continue to enjoy future presentations in this series. Thank you very much.